Okay, welcome back. We're going to pick up with the Indian Revolt of 1622, which really was a response to English colonization at Jamestown. They were producing tobacco and they had a system known as the headright system, which allowed English settlers to occupy these huge swaths of land. And the Indians were alarmed at the increased flow of English colonists into what they considered to be their land, and the English were taking this land and claiming it as theirs. So let's explain this response that the Powhatan tribe had to the English settlers as they continued to flow into this area. Now this here is a Indian chief known as Opechancanough. Now, Opechancanough is the brother of Powhatan and will be his successor. Now, as a young man, Opechancanough was taken to Spain and he even converted to Catholicism. However, he was not fond of the European colonialists because he eventually returned to Virginia on a Jesuit mission with the French, and what he did is he killed the missionaries. In 1609, he also captured John Smith, and that's where you get the famous story where he was going to be executed until Pocahontas saved his life. So Opechancanough is not a fan of the English colonists. Now in 1621, he becomes the main leader of the Powhatan Indians, and he changes his name to Massasoit, and he devises this plan to purge the English out of the Chesapeake. And so he secretly coordinates with 12 surrounding tribes and issues an attack on various English settlements up and down the James River, killing 347 colonists, or 1/3 of the total English population. Now, the settlers at Jamestown were tipped off to this English attack, but many other English settlers were not. And to one account, you can see this is very brutal, by the way. You can see Native Americans stabbing people, killing children. It was very brutal. One account says that the English came unarmed and they acted like they wanted to do peaceful business and trade with the settlers. This account says some even sat down at breakfast with our people at their tables, whom immediately with their own tools and weapons either laid down or standing in their houses, they basely and barbarously murdered them. The attack came out of nowhere. An account says it was so sudden in their cruel execution that few or none discerned the weapon or blow that brought them to destruction. And by this means, that fatal Friday morning, there fell under the bloody and barbarous hands of that perfidious and inhuman people, contrary to all laws of God and men, of nature and nations, 347 men, women, and children, most by their own weapons. And not being content with taking away life alone, they fell again upon the dead, making as well as they could a fresh murder, defacing, dragging, mutilating, and mangling the dead carcasses into many pieces, and carrying some parts away in derision with base and brutish triumph. That was an eyewitness account of someone who survived this attack. So this was a disastrous attack. Indian relations were not good. And the direct effect of this was the Virginia Company loses its charter over that territory, and there is a royal charter created. Now, a royal charter is a charter controlled by the crown. So now the king appointed a royal governor and a small advisory council and decreed the legal establishment of the Church of England and began taking taxes from this colony. So the Virginia Company is no longer in charge of the Virginia Company. Nevertheless, the Indian Rebellion of 1622 wasn't enough to wipe the colony out, and they were still producing tobacco. Now, in order to grow tobacco, you need a labor source. You need people to come live in that area. And that to give you some background, relates to something known as the head-right system. So in 1618, the Virginia Company introduced this head-right system, and under this system, anyone who paid for their own or another person's passage to Virginia received 50 acres of land. So immigration to the colony increased in this manner, and the head-right system yielded huge land grants for anyone who was wealthy enough to transport large numbers of people to Virginia. The company used the term plantation for the group of people who settled the land grant, but eventually the term was used to refer to the land itself. Now, their main labor source on these plantations isn't going to be African slaves, it's going to be indentured servants from England. Now, an indentured servant is a person who is paying for their passage, food, and shelter to North America with with an agreement to work for a certain amount of years, anywhere from 4 to 7 years. Now, these indentured servants were usually from the lower parts of society, and many were, of course, landless poor in Europe. Planters made a great deal through this indentured servant system because an indentured servant could often pay off the cost of their voyage 5 times in 1 year's of work, and the average amount of time an indentured servant worked was for 5 years. So they paid for their voyage, food, and shelter 25 times over before they were free. And you should know that it was not a happy life to be an indentured servant, and most of them never saw freedom. Approximately 1/2 of indentured servants died before completing the term of their contract, and you can see here they were not treated very well. 1/4 were free but remained poor, and only 1/4 actually acquired property and a better life. Now, this indentured servant problem is going to lead to a rebellion in Virginia. And this rebellion is important because in the aftermath of this rebellion, you are going to get the beginnings of African slavery in Virginia. So by the 1670s in Virginia, many of the free white men were former indentured servants who, although they had completed their servitude, had little money to buy land, and because they did not own land, they could not vote, and therefore they enjoyed almost no rights in colonial society. And these poor colonists lived out west. They lived on the western frontier where they were constantly fighting and under attack with Native American Indians. And this is going to be the context for Bacon's Rebellion. It starts as a problem with lack of land for former indentured servants and the threat of Indians in the West. Now, by the time Jamestown was founded in 1607, the Indian population in this area was 30,000. On the eve of Bacon's Rebellion in 1675, that Indian population had dwindled to 3,500. Meanwhile, the European population ballooned up to 38,000 people. And many of these landless settlers wanted to encroach upon the protected Indian land. And in 1675, a band of Virginia militiamen got into an altercation with an Indian tribe and murdered 30 Indians. Now, William Berkeley, here he is here, he is the governor of the Virginia colony, and he asks this ragtag militia to stop. But rather than stop, the militia doesn't listen and actually surrounds a Susquehannock village, another Indian village, and kills 5 chiefs who had come out to negotiate with that militia. So basically there's Indian conflict in the West, and the Susquehannocks retaliate and they raid outlying plantations and kill 300 whites. So this is a tense situation. Militias in the West are asking permission to go and fight the Indians, and the governor of Virginia, William Berkeley, is saying no. And that is going to lead to Berkeley's challenger, this man, Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Nathaniel Bacon is a young English migrant. He's 29 years old. He's well connected, a young aristocrat from England, and he was even appointed to the governor's council. and he apparently had a commanding personal presence, and he commanded the respect of the people around him. Now, Bacon wanted to attack the Native Americans in the West and take their land. Berkeley refused to grant Bacon a military commission to lead an attack on the nearby Indians, to which Bacon said, "That's fine, I'm going to do it anyway." And so Bacon rounded up his own militia and slaughtered some Indian tribes that were actually peaceful with the white settlers, the peaceful Doeg people. At this, Mr. Berkeley condemned Bacon and his militia. He kicked Nathaniel Bacon off of the governor's council, and he threw him in jail. Bacon's men marched into Jamestown and won his release from jail. And at the same time, there was new legislative elections in the House of Burgesses in Virginia, and a lot of Bacon's followers were elected into the local colonial government and passed laws to actually curb the power of the governor and restore voting rights to landless freemen, and to look favorably upon having a conflict with Indians in the West. Well, Nathaniel Bacon wasn't done. He published a manifesto, and it's called the Manifesto and Declaration of the People. And in this manifesto, he wrote that he wanted the death or the removal of all Indians and the end of the rule of wealthy parasites like William Berkeley. He further accused Governor William Berkeley of being a traitor, of not protecting the people from the Indians in the West, of overtaxing the landless poor and using that wealth for his own purposes and giving it to his friends, and of basically being corrupt. And Bacon basically broke ties with Berkeley and went to attack Indians in the West. Now, in response to all this, Governor Berkeley declared Nathaniel Bacon to be a traitor, and he declared his actions of attacking Indians in the West illegal. And what he's trying to do here is he's trying to prevent another Indian revolt of 1622. That's still fresh in his mind. Well, in response to this, Nathaniel Bacon took his men and his militia, many of them landless poors, blacks and whites combined, and he marched into Jamestown and he burned the city to the ground. He also went into William Berkeley's house and took basically anything that was valuable in his house and destroyed his home. William Berkeley retreated onto a ship and stayed out in the harbor to avoid being arrested and put on trial. Now, it looked like Nathaniel Bacon was going to take control of the Virginia colony, but he died unexpectedly. He got sick and died from dysentery in October 1676. With Nathaniel Bacon dead from dysentery, Governor William Berkeley takes his revenge. He basically comes back. He's got reinforcements from England. He disperses the rebel army. He seizes the estates of any of the rich rebels that were aligned with Nathaniel Bacon, and he hung 23 men. Now, what's the legacy of this? Well, the legacy of this is that the wealthy people of Virginia needed to make concessions to the landless poor, because they noticed in this uprising that landless poor indentured servants teamed up with African Americans to oppose the planter class in the East. So here's where the concessions were. William Berkeley promised to get rid of corruption. He began to support expansion into the West and Indian lands. He cut taxes on the lower social orders, but most importantly, they began to look for an alternate labor source other than indentured servants, and that is going to be African slavery. And this is where you have the beginning of laws passed that really restrict the rights of Africans in Virginia, starting with the fact that they cannot belong to a militia, cannot own weapons, cannot intermarry. And this is the beginning of the slave trade from Africa to Virginia.